Hi, everybody. Welcome to Culture and Sports. Welcome to our monthly Culture Roundtable. We have a particularly timely topic, and I have to say we have a fantabulous panel kind of here put together to talk about this. I don't know if I've ever seen a group more on point to talk about this today than the people we have here today, and it's a pleasure for me to do this. As a law professor and a lawyer, what else am I supposed to do other than have dialogues on really topical issues? Am I supposed to golf? Come on, man. So the short answer today is that we're gonna plumb for the next hour the topic of are college sports ungovernable, which really asks the question of are they governable and who should be governing them? We'll get into those topics. We'll break down the SCORE Act that kind of comes through this today. Uh, we have sort of a really good cross section, and I'm going to introduce them in the most cursory way. And when they come on to talk, we'll have them say a little bit about their background and other things, and we'll get that out. But Peter Gopperud is a longtime friend, a leading law school dean, an author of one of the formative sports law textbooks, and he joins us today from Florida. Kyle Saunders is the faculty athletics rep at Colorado State, a political scientist who's writing an extraordinary Substack piece, very topical to these issues, called Sacred Cow Barbecue, and it's stunning stuff. You should go read it. Bernard Muir has become a really, really wonderfully valued friend. He spent over 25 years in senior level positions in athletic administration, most recently retiring from the big chair at Stanford, but before that, athletic director at Delaware and Georgetown, and time spent at a lot of other schools you'd want to remember. And I remember him as a basketball player at Brown and got to see him play in person, so I have that recollection. Julie Summer is a lawyer, an athlete, the head of the Drake Educational Foundation and Trust, and she is also an All-American swimmer. So she brings those two perspectives. She's our youngin today, so she'll be the most recent college athlete in the group. The rest of us are sort of having, as somebody said recently, my athletic careers are aging like fine wine. Mine is aging like milk. And Frank Hawkins is for me the one person I've always been intellectually intimidated by. He is brilliant and done more in sports than almost any living lawyer functioning and practicing. He had 15 years as consigliere to Paul Tagliabue at the NFL. Before that, partner at Covington and Burling. Now of counsel at Shoemaker, Lupin Kendrick, the firm where I get to hang out my shingle and do my business. So, Frank, I want to start with you on the first question. I'm going to go to Bernard, so he's prepared on the second one. But Frank, you've talked a little bit about why we're here. You've talked a little bit about the NCAA making over a long period of time managing or governing through receiving litigation or getting litigation outcomes. We can debate when that started. Does it start with Board of Regents? Does it move through law? Does it really pick up a little later on with O'Bannon and Alston? But ultimately, what does that all mean? Why are we at? Why legally are we at where we're at?
Um, we are legally where we are because the NCAA has created the fine art of overreading dicta, going back to the Board of Regents case. They relied on amateurism for far, far too long, the dicta in the Brennan opinion. And instead of trying to come up with something rational, um, my old boss Tagliabue, who Bernard may remember from his Georgetown days, always said that it's not amateurism that this should be about. It should be about academicism, which is a hell of a word to pronounce. But basically, he said, we got into the whole amateurism thing, if you look at the history way back when, because schools would hire ringers. That's what we're trying to prevent. It's not a pay issue. It's no ringers. Have people making serious progress. Let's focus on that. And then, second thing he said on the Knight Commission, was football's different than everything else. Let's govern football differently because it has grown into a different ecosystem. NCAA didn't take up either of those things. They instead kept getting sued, and the losses kept piling up. And as was the case in the NFL, when Jeff Kessler found a judge that he liked, Judge Wilkin in Oakland, he kept going back to the same court and finally got to the point where the Jenga tower had to be, you had to recognize that the next piece out was going to collapse the Jenga tower, and he settled, or the NCAA settled. Unfortunately, they settled on terms that weren't designed to create a sustainable system. Um, and one lesson that we learned in the NFL was an antitrust settlement is very different than a sustainable system. Kessler negotiated an antitrust settlement there that Upshaw turned into a sustainable system. And my strong belief is that there needs to be an Upshaw in college sports who helps to create a sustainable system working on behalf of the athletes.
Bernard, I'm going to come to you on an immediate response, and I'll also note that you're consulting with Huron a number of other places. So you're not really sparing your time. You're in the space looking at it differently. With the benefit of that perspective, when did you notice as an athletic director that things were different in practice? Can you trace a time and say
Yeah.
things we jumped the shark here or things got harder there?
I think Frank gave a great summary here. And as I think back of my career when I started at the NCAA in the early 90s, amateurism was what was drilled into our head. The reason why we're doing this is for the student athlete experience. It's rooted in education. And I think we were holding true to that for so long. I've been out of the chair, athletic director chair, for about a year and a half. I'd go back 2 years prior as House was coming down the pike here when it really dawned on us like, okay, this is going to be different, and we are going to find ways in which to generate student athletes can uh, profit from getting additional dollars from the university, aside from the scholarship and the travel and the food and all the other things that we've been providing over the years. This became a different era, and I remember having the opportunity to talk to President Baker, who actually came to our campus and was visiting with some of our trustees and some of our donors, and just saying the world is going to look different. We're still not sure what that's going to look like, and really trying to get our arms around. You could take some of your resource and pay it directly to the student athlete. Now, I, as an athletic director, knowing that I was at the time in charge of 36 sports, I was fearing the thought of 36 sport coaches now coming to me saying, I don't have enough. And, I've heard that refrain over the years, but now when we're talking about actual dollars and trying to, provide revenue sharing, I would say in that probably 4 years ago, this was really becoming real. Like we were going to have to figure this out. And as Frank mentioned, the term unsustainable, and I hear that so many times from peers across the industry. I would have to agree. Where is the resource coming from? I'm seeing that especially in my Huron work, where they're trying to figure out, schools are trying to figure out how do we continue to do this and stay in the game. Everyone wants to compete at a high level. Everyone loves the exposure that comes from competing across Division I, especially. But how to make that happen really becomes the devil is in the details there.
And I loved it. I was just smiling in the sense that you said when a coach will come to you and say, "Can I have more?" Isn't that what every coach says when they get out of bed in the morning? Can I have more of something? It is the nature of coaches. Peter,
Correct.
I want to bring you into this one, right into that question. You're our law academic expert. Um, and we've kind of led that Frank has said that the NCAA has chosen to be a rule taker through litigation rather than a system provider. Kessler has entered the field to have bites at the apple effectively. We've also had the O'Bannon case go forward. But Peter, right now, can you kind of set up the legal environment that got us here and where we're headed, particularly with legislation that's out there?
Well, I think Frank uh, kind of ran through some of the litigation track that has gotten us to where we are right now. Board of Regents certainly started things down the path. The law case, the restricted earnings coach case, was the next big thing. And as I've said in numerous settings, if you want to avoid antitrust liability, don't call something restricted earnings for a starter. But I think that the biggest kind of driver of where we are today, and this has been building for more than 50 years, I think, is the nature of the association itself. You've got more than 1,100 colleges and universities, three divisions, and let's forget the three divisions and look only at Division One. Within Division One, it's 360 some member schools, and they range in budgets from somewhere, 14, $15 million a year to, Texas probably threatening to go over 300 million very soon in budgets. Uh, they all are attempting to legislate, to make rules that somehow avoid litigation, although I would argue they've gotten really bad legal advice for uh, that entire 50 years with lots of different things. But it's like herding cats on steroids. I'm in the middle of reading book that Donald Remy just published a week or so ago, the former general counsel and COO of the NCAA, and it's a very interesting read, and he kind of tracks from his view from the inside some of the mistakes, some of the mistakes built around the amateurism concept and where and how that has created all sorts of things. But I think that the biggest thing, and Kyle, I'm sure can speak to this, but and you too, Bob. I've sat in front of faculty meetings as a dean at four different law schools, and in that role, while I was responsible for a lot of things, I didn't have any more power than Charlie Baker does right now to make the rules. And I was doing that with in one case, 50 or 60 faculty members, and in another extreme school where we had 20 faculty members. And, lots of times how faculty would vote on different things depended upon who the last person was that bought them a beer at the campus hangout. And to a certain extent, that's the NCAA. The big guys have always been the big guys, but they're getting separated from the rest of the field more and more. Below the G6 is a huge chasm, but even within the P4, there are haves and have-nots on a relative basis, and that means that when it comes to trying to to implement to draft and implement new rules, you've got some very definite competing interests, and I think we heard a little bit of that from some of the comments out of the SEC media days yesterday and the day before, with Greg Sankey making comments about it's time for them to make their own rules, and the media kind of misinterpreting that as to say that the SEC is going to take their football and go home. But uh, 3, 4, 5 years from now, I think things are going to be very different. But what that's going to be, I don't know.
Hard to tell. Right, it's hard to predict. I'm going to use an analogy from my college days. I understand professional sports and league dynamics because I studied European history in the 16th and 17th century. I understand the current challenges of college athletics because math challenge that I am. I might have had an honest job if I could do math, but the idea is I took physical geography, and what we're having right now is a version of plate tectonics moving and shifting against each other, and we're seeing that intra conference and inter-conference in the same way. We have big power schools trying to eat each other, eat the smaller ones, and at the same time, there's a schism, which I even saw when I worked at Penn State inside the Big Ten. There's a schism between the top earning schools that draw 100,000 for football and those that don't, and that revenue disparity can be exceptionally great. We've kind of turned to a legislative moment. And Kyle, that's going to warm you and Julie up. So I'm get some tosses in because I'm coming to both of you, and then it's kind of open season for everybody after that. But we've had we've had about Julie, I'll throw to you first. We've had what, how many? About eight, nine, 10 bills that have come through Congress, but two are of the most significance, right?
That's right. I would say even more, Bob, when you consider there were some bills. I know Senator Cantwell had a very aggressive, a smart bill in 2021 that she was working on, essentially behind the scenes. It never got dropped because she's always been intent on
It's still
bipartisan.
out there, right? This is the 401k idea.
That's part of it, yes.
Yeah.
But there was another even wholesale bill on college athletics when she was chair of the Commerce Committee and Senator Roger Wicker was the ranking member. It was interesting to be involved in that. It never got introduced because she's always been intent, and that's her style as a legislator to be bipartisanship and be in her approach and didn't have the support of Senator Wicker, so that never got introduced. But here we are. The problems continued to, grow worse. As Peter mentioned, cats on steroids now, and here we are 5 years later, and there's kind of no choice but to try and drop something because there's so much, call to do something in terms of the things that people really get their ire up, the transfer portal, right? And athlete movement and NIL that's run amok. And certainly there are issues with that. But I think I don't know that the Protect College Sports Act, the PCSA, is the answer. Certainly as it is written right now. And the SCORE Act was definitely not the answer.
We're sort of treating symptoms to of the current tectonic shift, not necessarily the shift itself, right? Would you say that that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely. We talk about college sports being governable now, but were they ever really governable? We have this myth of self-regulation, right? That under the NCAA's legacy structure, you can't effectively regulate a multi-billion-dollar commercial enterprise with a voluntary membership association model. So they've had this fundamental conflict of interest for a long time now, asking institutions to police their own economic ambitions, certainly their own desire to win championships that comes along with those economic ambitions. And that is, having been a swimmer at University of Texas, I benefited from a school that really did invest in our program, very grateful for that. But we know that largely, generally across the country, that those resources are directed into big sports, right? And it's, I don't think college sports have ever really had a revenue problem, but they certainly have a spending problem.
They've spent every dollar they've had for the most part, plus a little bit, right? Bernard will probably nod to that.
Yeah.
Kyle, you're on track to sort of define the legislative solution, if you can, in about 3 words.
Yeah, good luck. I think of this for those of you familiar with my work, but I'll try to summarize quickly. I really do think about this from a political economy perspective and from an incentives perspective a lot. And so when I am mapping out the things that Julie was talking about the myriad actors in the space, I'm really trying to think about, the power differentials, the resource differentials, those sorts of things that Bob was talking about in his lead into this. And so I think that's a crucial way, and I'm happy to return to that at some point. But I think that sets up a mode of thought about this and again, I'm on a call with a great number of litigators. So I will not try to be one, but it is, the litigation phase, as Frank and Peter both said, this has been ongoing for a very long time. And now, to Julie's point, we've been engaged in many pieces of legislation. But I don't think we're in a legislative phase like people think. The legislative phase, and then this legislative phase that we are in, is now inside this black box, right? We've got a piece of legislation that is sitting on a website that is never going to be what actually comes to the floor, if it ever comes to the floor. That's the first part, right? If you try to analyze whatever the legislation that's up there and then try to go through various reporting and all these other sorts of things and try to discern who's talking about political motivations, like what Ted Cruz's piece in, I think it was USA Today, yesterday or today, I can't remember when it was, it might have been this morning, was basically just laying out, here's my rhetoric, here's my propaganda about this, and everybody's taking it as, well, it's done now, we'll just move on. I don't think that's correct. I do think that we did have the June markup. It was public. It was somewhat interesting. It kind of went as pro forma in many ways. But the negotiation isn't public, and we're reading it through competing leaks. They contradict each other. One week a staffer says the Senate already has 75 votes. The next an outlet says the sponsors won't bend. There's tons and tons of conflicting, and anytime you try to dig into that, I come back to what are the incentives for the legislators? Who are their I did not mean to do that, whatever that is. Whatever the incentives for the legislators, whatever their particular balance, I would argue, especially since this has turned into P2 versus non P2, as a cleavage, the number of schools, I think that's why Ted Cruz tends to be on the side of the non P2s, because he's in Texas, which has 9 non P2 schools and 2 P2 schools, and their amount of resources outweigh the other. Um, but my number is still 15-20% of this thing actually seeing, getting to the end of the process. It
You
may
went there
come.
without me prompting. That's great. So where do you see score? Let's go back. That was really a Republican bill coming out of the House
Yes.
that was pretty draconian, at least to the athlete side of things. Is it dead? Is it like the killer in one of the Scream movies? Maybe with a comeback. Where do you see that right now? And then we'll get into PCSA, which I think is more nuanced, right?
Here's how I think about that. Score was written for the power conferences and died of Republican politics, whereas the PCA was written to be bipartisan and is dying of conference politics.
Okay, fair enough.
And that to me, when you think about Score, and I think Julie characterized it perfectly, it was a Republican right leaning, I think is a fair characterization, piece of legislation that was more on the business side, more on the capitalism side, if you will. I will stop using my hands. That is really irritating me. But and that's where Cantwell and Cruz were trying to aim this to be more bipartisan. And in doing so, they obviously introduced a piece of legislation. And my whole take on this has been the actual passage. The point of getting it to pass and get enough Democratic support was the bill had to move to the left, meaning that it probably had to have more student athlete interest. It had to have some equalization of resources and or outcomes in some way, not necessarily allowing the P2 to escape or be resource superior, if that's the right way of saying it. So it's really interesting, and again, I'm not quite sure where Score these pieces of legislation, they never really die. To Julie's point, I mean, they're there once they get on the website somewhere. They can, until they have a vote, and they can be introduced, they can be cobbled, they can be thrown on the back of other pieces of legislation. There's all sorts of other things that can happen. In fact, that's one of the things I think actually could happen with PCSA, which we can talk about, is I don't actually think it goes through standard process. I think it actually will probably be an add-on to in November or December, if it's going to get through. And we can talk about that too. But I think I'll stop there.
Bernard, I'm gonna come to you only because I want to get the perspective of somebody who is a practitioner and in the most pressed role on campus as an athletic director or now consulting and being the confessor of an athletic directors or athletic directors. Um, what would an athletic director see in congressional or legislative help here? What would be in it on the good side, and what, if anything, is on the bad or worrisome side from the AD's chair?
I think for so long we've talked about having some guardrails and having this competition, and we tried to do it on our own, as Julie mentioned earlier, and we failed as a membership trying to figure that out. Now we're looking for greater help, and now we're depends on where you sit, what conference you sit in, what institution you're at, as to what type of help you might need or assistance you might need. Could be financial, could be this transfer portal, as Julie mentioned earlier, like you have this student athletes coming and going, but having some type of structure that we can all live in, and whoever we have to define all, but let's say Division One, and as somebody mentioned earlier, what the disparity between the entire membership of Division One is vast. So you're just trying to find some common ground that a framework where everyone can say we agree to this, and we now need congressional help to put that in place, and then also hopefully temper the amount of litigation that is coming back at schools and conferences and the NCAA itself. If they can temper that, and then we could say, okay, this is how we move forward, and as Kyle has mentioned, there's so many different iterations of these bills. It'd be nice to just come to some common ground. And I don't know if that's going to be possible, whether it's later this fall or sometime in the near future, but it would be helpful as a practitioner to have that framework in which to work from.
We're going to come back to the common ground question in a second, but I want to bring Peter and Frank in because I know exactly what they've been doing the last 2 days. They've been reading the latest draft of the PCSA to tell us what's in it, to tell us what's maybe missing and critique it. So, gentlemen, have at it.
Frank, I'll let you go.
All right. I'll say two
What's
things.
good about
Uh, bloody little.
it? Okay. All right. Tell me what's
Look,
bad.
look.
Hey, it's better. It's better than score.
There you go.
Yeah, and it's better than score because the antitrust exemption is narrower. Before Paul died, I last fall, I was talking with him about some of this stuff, and he he said to me, we never would have been as successful as we were had we not had to deal with antitrust suits from the likes of Davis and Jones pushing us to think outside the box. And so it's a good thing that the antitrust exemption in PCSA is narrower than SCORE, which would have created a very sclerotic organization dominated by the P2. But at the same time, the antitrust exemption that is in there, which is for basically all labor matters, um, is going to lead to dissension, I think, going forward. What is missing in there? I think that there's two things that are missing. Number one is if you're going to have a salary cap, that's based on average revenue. This is average revenue, not of everybody in D1, the D1 salary cap that you have to opt into if you're going to make any direct payments to athletes, but it's based on the highest revenue subset of those schools. And it's therefore not achievable for most anybody. I'll go back to the um, Levin report, which if you did pro sports labor, you'd be familiar with. It's the report commissioned by Bud Selig in the year 2000 saying that on day one, um, basically 25 out of 28 teams really didn't have a chance to make the postseason because of the economics. That structure exists in college sports in spades. It's going to work okay if the schools that don't have the revenue are able to compete for something meaningful. But the way the PCSA is structured, more and more revenue is likely to be sucked out of lower levels and make it very difficult to uh, sustain viable programs at lower levels. Second thing that I would note that is missing is revenues to match the mandates. There are good things in the PCSA, athlete benefits, 10-year scholarship protections, um, and various other things in there. A 9-year moratorium on cutting women's sports and so on, but there's no money to go with it, which in an era where schools generally are facing strained budgets due to changes in federal funding, changes in tuition eligibility and international students, and changes upcoming with the enrollment cliff. Um, they're already facing stretched budgets and finding money for 10-year scholarship projections, et cetera, is not going to be easy. And that's a big issue in the PCSA.
You
Well,
clearly
and I
the
think
phrase unfunded money. I was going to you, Peter. Go ahead.
no, I think and Frank, I think to kind of jump off on that piece of it, and we don't have any necessarily real good dollar numbers on it, although the 60 million that's in the bill, if you spread that out over the member schools evenly, which is not a good idea, but if it gets spread out in terms of reduced distributions, that's going to be more than 100,000 per school, and that's on top of, again, looking to the CCA 22 conferences. Uh, they got hit the hardest by the House damages settlement. Now, and while the athletes haven't seen any money from those damages yet because of the appeal, the distributions have been reduced, and so they're having to deal with that already in a disproportionate fashion. I'm concerned
And
about. Go
by
ahead.
the way, the student athletes at the CCA 22 and at the G6 are already feeling the effects in terms
Yeah,
of reduced support services,
yeah.
et cetera. Whereas the P4 schools and certainly the P2 schools um, don't have to worry about it because they're rolling in TV money, comparatively speaking.
Right, and I think one of the things that I keep seeing, and we, in terms of both the media and what I'm hearing behind the scenes from Senate staff folks, is the belief on the part of CCA 22 schools and certainly some G6 schools is that there's all sorts of financial benefits for them, either direct or indirect, in this bill. And I fail to see where that really is. With regard to the antitrust exemption, yeah, it's limited, but it covers all of the most important things for the athletes. And
All the things the athletes would negotiate for if they negotiated,
right,
right?
exactly. And ultimately, I would love to see uh, something along the lines of a bill that is lingering out there and going nowhere at the moment, that provides for amendment of the National Labor Relations Act to allow college athletes to collectively bargain and still not be termed employees, but to allow them to do that. Um, I think that end game, if you will, is potentially good for everybody and bad for everybody, which is the ideal thing that you want to have in a negotiated settlement. And you know, Frank knows that obviously from all your time in the NFL. But the athletes need to have a seat at the table. And while the student athlete advisory committee structure allows for that, as I listen to the vast majority of student athlete advisory committee members uh, in various settings, uh, they've been largely handpicked at a lot of places. They've been largely handpicked by many of the conferences, and we'll say, we'll kind of stick to the party line. We've now seen some athletes come out very forcefully against the PCA and for much more athlete involvement. And I think that ultimately, I think that can be good for everybody.
Yeah.
I'm
I've,
going to shift. Go ahead, Frank. And I'm going to
I,
shift to the rest of your comment. Yep.
yeah, I was just going to say that the 5-and-5 litigation is a classic example of how, if athlete interests were taken into account to a greater extent, there wouldn't be this litigation. The rule was imposed for a bright line, but there are all these specific factors that weren't considered in imposing the rule. Now, there's two ways that those are going to be resolved. One is in litigation, or number two is in a bargaining process where the student athletes on their side say, here's 10 possible scenarios. Let's fix for five of these. And five of these are so remote that you're just out of luck if they happen. And then you've got an organized process. You potentially have a grievance process and so on. But in the absence of a bargaining situation, if rules are imposed as opposed to negotiated, and if the athlete's interests aren't expressed and taken into account, you're going to end up in litigation over and over and over.
And you've made the comment, and one I very much like, that even if you have to defend with the rule of reason and antitrust, at least having talked to somebody gives you some sense of those issues. Bernard, I wanted to come back to you and bring you back into the conversation on a couple of issues. And one of them is if we looked at the director's trophy given to the best all sports program in college athletics, and is there a trophy for that?
There is. There's been the Director's Cup for.
I know it's the Director's Cup, but I didn't know if there was a physical trophy. It would look like you.
Oh, there is. There
Gonna
is. There
say.
is a
I
physical
was
trophy
going to
that goes
say
with it.
it would be like you, Bernard. It would be if you've won it how many times? Like
We
18,
wanted,
17,
we wanted, we wanted quite a bit, and Julie's alma mater
won it a few times. Yep.
has won it a few times now. So it makes for a great competition. But as somebody said, I think Frank mentioned this, the resource now that it requires to have that overall excellence is much more significant. And schools are really trying to pinch pennies and stretch themselves even further to just vie for this thing and vie for just success across the board, not just for for that trophy, but for other sports. Makes it really challenging.
It is we talk a lot about this, and we're kind of speculating, and obviously the PCSA talks about a pooling mechanism on some of the revenue and the broadcast revenue, but really there isn't right now a source of new money, is there?
There really isn't. I mean, schools are trying to pull every lever that they possibly can. The certainly now I'm seeing this from my inner circle sports work that private equity, private capital, public-private partnerships are now terms that I never used when I first started in the business, but now schools are saying, "Hey, tell me about that because it could potentially be additional capital put into your department." And so they're trying to figure out how do we do this still maintain the competitive balance across our conferences and nationally. But it's becoming more and more of an issue as certainly as we go along. And so that's the balancing act that every AD is trying to figure out and how far can a school go and also meet the demands that the institution has across the board, whether it be enrollment or other great ideas that are popping up across the campus. And meanwhile, as somebody said earlier, like their budgets are being pulled in a number of different directions. So how can you just do this for just athletics?
student.
Bob, can I
Oh,
usurp
yeah,
your
Peter, jump in.
moderator?
Yeah,
I want to usurp your moderator role and ask Bernard a
and
question
yeah.
with regard to the PCSA or anything that we've seen come from the Hill since 2021 so far. Over the years, the NCAA, one of the things that the NCAA has been able to do is rule make kind of on the fly, sometimes not in the best way, but recognize change needs to be in place and to quickly, uh, relatively speaking, address it. If these things like in the PCA end up getting codified and there are issues that need to be dealt with, they're going to have to go back to Congress. And I mean, that's to me, that's one thing that nobody's talking about
Yeah.
here. What do you think?
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, just as cumbersome as this process has been, we need to be able to be nimble, and we've not been over the years. We haven't demonstrated that before, but it has been great that where we could come together and at least for some rules, if we're not challenged from others, to be able to govern ourselves to a degree. We need a set of principles that hopefully we can get past, and then let us go about, when I say us, the membership, to go about our business to work that out. Now, I don't know where that line is drawn,
Yeah.
but it would be nice to have some flexibility because you're right. If we have to go back to Congress each time we need to change something, as we go along, we're going to learn a lot about what's true, what can be modified. But if we have to go back each time, that's going to be really slow down the process and make a lot of people unhappy.
And
I
just
have a lot
Most
of questions.
importantly, the student athletes, right? We're
I have
not
a lot of
servicing them.
Bernard, thank you. I had a lot of questions I want to go to Julie with, but I'm going to Kyle on exactly that point.
well, I was just going to follow up on Bernard because I think there's another thing you have to remember here is that between the fiscal cliff, between challenges with AI, between I mean, most of our institutions are in a world of hurt. And whereas athletics used to be able to come to campus when it's necessary and ask for things, ask for assistance, those sorts of the answer is a lot harder to get those resources right now. I mean, what do you see from Utah? You see private capital. What do you see from Houston? You see tapping $100 million of the endowment. Um, these are exigencies, right? I mean, I think so, and I don't use that word lightly. By the way, it is that dire in some states. And again, that varies by state and their budgets and those sorts of things. But I think that's an underlying condition that you have got to consider. And why, to Bernard's point and to Julie's points, the drive for revenue and athletics generated revenue is higher than it's ever been, and that's not going away. That's going to
Kyle,
get so much more severe.
Kyle and Bernard, do you see the athletic department being tapped the other way back to campus? Not only you're asked to be self-sustaining, but you're asked to give some back in some cases. Isn't that a move that we're trying to see if if you're going to command these dollars, you've got to generate these dollars?
I think that's right. I know Bernard had
Oh,
anything.
Kyle, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think this gets back to the resource disparity. I think there's a lot of institutions. What are there? 31 institutions that are actually above board on
No.
revenues. And so when you think about whether it's subsidy levels or other aspects of campus contributions, those 31 are tend to be, they're obviously P2 and they're obviously or well, that's not true. There's a couple that are outside the P2, but they are they are already able to give something back to campus if they are asked in some way. Now, are they asked? Not really, because they've been generating their own. Now it's a real question when you get into that kind of next tier of how much money can you give back? How much, what are the transfers, whether that's scholarships, those sorts of things. What's the campus environment on that? Because it gets very political in many ways with regard to just even revenues flying from side to side. So it's a fraud environment. I'll leave it at
No.
that.
And Kyle, I think you're hitting on something that's like, well, how do you define giving back? Because in some cases, you're already paying for the scholarship full freight, the out-of-state costs for bringing a student to campus. There's other subsidies that are flowing back and forth to the athletic department, no doubt. But I think schools are saying, hey, and I've heard this refrain over and over, we got to run this like a business. Well, it's really hard to run a business when so many of your sports are not profitable, right? And so to be asked to give back more, it's just putting greater pressure. But schools are asking their athletic departments to become even more business minded, really look at every lever and try to pull it the furthest within the extent that is appropriate for an educational environment. So that's why you see some of these schools conferences really trying to push the envelope to say we can do something different here in order to generate dollars.
And back to your
And at the same
director's,
token,
go ahead, sorry. And back to your
and at the same token, be really judicious with the dollars that you do have.
Yep.
And
yep. And back to your director's cup point. I mean, each school has a different priority for its cost centers, right?
That's
And so how they balance that out is at the individual institutional level, and they have to make those decisions. So.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question. Bernard and Julie, I want to focus a little bit on this because, Bernard, you ran one of the best all sports programs in the history of college athletics at Stanford for a long while, and pretty good ones at the other two schools you were in the big chair for. Julie, you were certainly part of one of the greatest women's sports programs and all sports programs at Texas, and your sport is one that was very much central to that of swimming. It wasn't as much peripheral. The Texas Swim Center is the most exciting environment I've been in for college or amateur athletic event ever. So, Julie, how do we manage this, and how do we keep sports that are part of the Olympic program, a key part of what college life is about, together? Bernard, Julie, jump on this. Just go into this as you go.
I think that's
Julie,
great.
let's go first.
Okay, thanks, Bernard. I think that's a great question, Bob. I know Bernard mentioned a little bit ago about the Directors Cup, which is a fantastic thing, but and it's fun to see schools. I don't know if every school competes as aggressively as say Stanford in Texas for that trophy, but I think we need more than a trophy to incentivize schools to really, not prioritize competitive dominance over long-term stability, broad-based sports sponsorship, and hey, academic integrity. I think a lot of schools need that guidance, and incentivizing them with the trophy certainly isn't the answer for a large portion of them. So, I look at schools like, you mentioned swimming, Bob, and obviously I love that sport and care about that sport, but I care about all Olympic sports. And you look at a school like Cal Poly, swimming's really popular in the state of California. It always has.
I've heard that.
There's a reason for that, I think. And it seems it's to me, like a canary in the coal mine when you have a California school cutting their men's and women's swimming program. And I want to squeeze in something on Title IX here, but
I was going to go there next with you.
Okay, good. I can do it now if you like.
Go for it. Go for it, because it is another force of gravity in this argument, and it's implicated in the legislative fixes too.
It is, but the legislation isn't doing enough. Certainly, we would like to see the PCSA, do more on that. I think Senator Cantwell has definitely been open to that and sees that need. But of course, we're dealing with a congressional body here on these issues. But Cal Poly, when they did that, they pulled one of these sort of old school accounting tricks, if you will, in terms of roster numbers, right? And that's a section in the PCSA. But Cal Poly, when they cut the men's and swimming programs, they added stunt. And, the old tricks used to be using indoor and outdoor track as separate numbers in reporting, rowing having 60 rowers to a team, right? When really only about a dozen actually end up competing. And now you have the rise of sports like stunt and acro. Well, they have 55 or 65 players, but only about 25, compete. So I don't think you should really have a team exceeding about 35 roster spots. And so the schools haven't, enforced the law. The NCAA has historically refused to build gender equity in its regulations. And then the OCR, which has since been weakened even more, has remained perpetually under-resourced. So in the same vein, the PCSA, it's section 125, that they would make roster spots set at the 2024-2025 levels, which would effectively become a ceiling rather than, a floor. So we're in 2026 and 93% of schools are still out of compliance with Title IX. So they would be effectively be codifying that. And disclosures are important as well. So it needs to consider the Equity in Athletics Act disclosure numbers in that. And, that's what, unfortunately, even Judge Wilkin said, Title IX, not the place, not the time in my courtroom. So leaving the women up to do what? Have to sue their school.
Thank you, Bernard. I'm mindful of time, and we've imposed on you, and you have another call coming up at the top of the hour. So we're going to give you the first last word, and thank you so much for your contribution, so much for what you've added in experience, and just in advancing this topic and dialogue with all of us. So, want to give us a closing thought?
Well, I thank you, Bob, for just including me in this conversation. Obviously, impressed by the group, the panelists that are here, and I just think we have to continue this conversation. Hopefully, we're going to get to some outcomes here in the near future, and then we'll have to recalibrate and go about our business because we know that whatever happens will not be sufficient, and there's more to come. But the dialogue, at least starting this and having so many people, especially from the campuses and conferences involved, trying to kind of met out what is appropriate for college sport moving forward is at least a start. And as somebody said earlier, yes, we need to have the student voice present. I don't know how you, with 500 student athletes competing at the highest level, how do you get their voices all heard and in a meaningful way? But I definitely think that is going to be necessary, and we have to keep that in mind. And as Julie's comment about Title IX is super important as well, and having broad-based programs so important for the Olympic movement, which is going to continue. So I hope we can have all these different things factored in as we continue to move forward. But thank you for allowing me to participate.
Thanks for joining, and thanks for your friendship. We really appreciate it. And now we'll talk behind your back, right? Thank
Perfect.
you again.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you
great
again.
day, everyone.
I want to bring us back to something Frank said about 5 for 5. I thought that's a hot topic right now. Uh, Full disclosure, Peter, do you want to make our full disclosure?
Full disclosure here is that Bob and I are attorneys of record in a class action uh, case in federal court in Colorado that was filed about 2 weeks ago on behalf of 11 student athletes. We're seeking class certification. We anticipate some action by the court possibly as early as next week, as all briefing deadlines end at midnight on Monday.
Well, thank you. Tell us about 5 for 5. Tell us about your thoughts on it. Everybody react, and we'll go about 3 or 4 minutes on 5 for 5, the litigation, the issues, everything that's extant to it, and then we'll get out to some last words.
Where? Me?
Yeah, you were going, Peter.
Okay.
Stay
Uh,
going.
I uh, I honestly think that the concept of eligibility duration limits is a good one. I think that there are different there's some good ways to do it. Unfortunately, the NCAA has not chosen to take what I would consider to be a good approach, largely because of the failure to grandfather those athletes, and there's hundreds of them and thousands of them in the high school class of 2022. I think that uh, certainly uh, the timing of the actions of the Division I cabinet in implementing this rule is also problematic. It's something that's been talked about since last fall, and they did not implement the rule or vote on the rule and launch it until June 23rd, at which point all of those athletes who are foreclosed at the moment from taking advantage of a fifth year under this new rule, uh, many of them have nowhere to go. They're out there. They have been not only closed out under the rule, but as a practical matter, with roster spots and revenue share opportunities and everything else, um, we believe that they've been treated very unfairly. The concept, again, I don't have a problem necessarily with the concept. I do think that The exceptions that have been built into that rule are too narrow and overlook situations where schools have abusive coaches that might impact an entire team and their eligibility situations and situations where sports are dropped and there's some other flaws in it, but that's my
And,
2 cents worth.
and it contains a limitation on transfers attached to it too, in the same way, or at least it's connected to it in the PCSA. Julie, I want to come to you on the and I've sort of said often that 5-for-5 eligibility is better than 4-and-5 for a variety of reasons, but there are some real problems from an athlete perspective. Do you want to outline those?
Sure, I would say, and you know this well, Bob, with you've pointed out many times in your filing of this, but to me, the biggest problem is disincentivizing injury recovery and rehabilitation for athletes, right? Um, you have, you know, athletes have two ACLs, two Achilles, you rupture one, perhaps you rupture both, right? When they suffer that, this rule, it's an unyielding clock, meaning, every month spent in rehab is a month of eligibility burned. The NCAA is trying to say they look out for athlete health and well-being. This really flies in the face of that. So athletes would face even more intense pressure than they ever have, both self-imposed, and we know how athletes are, right? They're highly motivated. They want to play. They're there to play. They're there to train and there to play. So they would have both self-imposed and coaching pressure to rush back to play to compete before even they're fully healed. So they're risking re-injury, they're risking career-ending damage for both their college career and perhaps a professional career. So it lacks this necessary medical safety net for athletes. And then also, let's, again, to bring it back to educational autonomy and graduate pursuits, right? Which is a great thing that athletes can go to a graduate degree and continue to pursue their sport while they're pursuing an advanced professional degree. So this would limit that. So and that again contradicts the education first rhetoric when the NCAA is emphasizing academic achievement.
Kyle, a quick reaction on that?
Well, incentives are everything, in a way, and I I am heartened by both Bernard and Julie's points about student athletes. Obviously, in my role as far, I think that's paramount in this whole endeavor, and I think one of the things that sometimes gets lost, especially in this new environment, is that these are 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old human beings. And I think while they are definitely in some cases getting paid well, and in other cases, the resources are flying to them. It's really about these many other student. There are many other student athletes who are getting yes, they're getting something, and it's a wonderful thing, but it's also a very, very difficult, strenuous, stressful career in a way that really, and again, I love student athletes. They're high achievers. They are really trying to do everything that they can, but it's also, I think there's a certain, at least one of the changes I've seen in the newer environment is that I don't want to use dehumanize. I think that's too strong, but I think it's there's a lack of consideration, especially for the stress levels in some cases, right? And I see that at other, in other institutions. I'm happy to say that at my institution it's wonderfully, and we treat them very well. And of course, I don't want to be critical of anyone, but it's more, I think we really have to keep that centered, right? I think that's a very, very important concern amidst all of this, and it can get lost.
I am the tragedy of this role is that we don't have enough time. We never do, and that's the beauty of it too. Frank, I kept you out of the last conversation, so I'm going to I think we can squeeze out about 2 minutes more. I'm going to give you the first last word and maybe prompt you to Is there a sustainable system that can be created? Is there a governance model that could work that other than what we're talking about?
Um, yeah, I think that there's a governance model that could work. I do think that the NCAA was on its way to something that made sense by setting up the transformation committee and devolution and all that sort of stuff. But what they never focused on is that what you're really all about here is creating opportunities not for Pavia or any of the other superstar quarterbacks. They're going to get theirs in the pros and they will get well paid in college. But you're all about creating opportunities for the Julie Summers of the world, the women's swimmers. You're about creating opportunities for women's field hockey players who have to take a year off for the Olympics and this, that, and the other. Um, Kyle really set things up with his comment on the incentives. I think that there needs to be a real serious discussion about the incentives and objectives here. Right now, the incentives are set by a, to put it generously, bizarre set of class definitions in the House settlement, where the value of student athletes is dictated by GRPs and whether they got a scholarship. Walk-ons are undervalued. People in Olympic sports are undervalued. It's not about the effort that they put in and the growth that they get with those incentives or growth they get from participating in student athletics. Um, it's about the amount of TV revenue that they've generated. There needs to be a serious discussion instead of just codifying that about what are the objectives here and how, as we devolve, do you take some of the funding from the richest conferences and use it to the benefit of the system as a whole over time? Doesn't have to be a big exit tax or anything like that if they go more autonomous. But there just needs to be a serious discussion in which you focus on the overall system. And the NCAA started down the road. They haven't finished it. Um, they haven't started down the road of commercialization. There's tons of low-hanging fruit that could be put in place to generate more revenue that could be used on a structural basis to subsidize schools and sports that need it. Just needs to be done thoughtfully. I believe that there is a solution. Otherwise, I wouldn't be at this at my advanced age. So
I'm going to cut it to about 30 seconds each. Peter?
I think that somewhere out there there is a solution. I think it's important that there be consistency, there be equity in the solution. There has to be the athlete voice in a meaningful way in the solution, and any guardrails in place should be guardrails that are accommodating. And by that, I mean not guardrails that if you crash into them will kill you.
Kyle, you just texted your note to us, but go ahead and give it to us.
Sorry, my button wouldn't hit. I when I talk about incentives, I do think there is a system that can evolve, but it's exactly those conversations that Frank and Peter really want us to engage. And I really hope that they can be done. But the only way that's going to happen is if we actually sit down and understand the incentives that are there for each actor in this. This is one of the most complex, and public policy nerd, political scientist, all those other caveats I can throw at this, but this is one of the most complex sets of incentives that I've ever seen. and it is very, very, very difficult to negotiate. And so I put a link to a table of where I laid out all of those incentives. And what's very interesting about it is that the people lacking power in this whole system are the ones who need to be protected, and the ones who have power benefit by the vagaries of the lack of protections. So I'll leave it at that.
Our friend Charlie Grantham said a vacuum by which the NCAA currently manipulates. Julie, go ahead. Last word
Absolutely.
and bring it to a close. Thank you.
Will do real quick. I think, Frank, Kyle, and Peter also just nailed it with incentives and objectives. And with regards to the current pending legislation with the PCSA, the Drake Group, we've championed for decades the formation of a meaningful commission. So our preference has always been a commission of experts under a timeline to study and provide a viable report and recommendations for policy changes. And with this legislation or any other, question is why solidify that before something, a meaningful commission can provide that, as everyone here would be great to be on.
It is a gorgeous day where I am. I'm sorry for running over people who are listening, attendees. If you're looking for this, it will live on YouTube in perpetuity, hopefully, therefore. But thank you, Bernard, in absentia. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Frank. And I have to agree that this was better than an afternoon on the golf course. If you've seen my golf game, you know it was. So thank you again. Thanks for coming. Audience members, we're open to some questions via either LinkedIn or through Culture and Sports. And thank you for your attention. And again, thanks for indulging us a few minutes longer than normal. Thanks.